episode of the 2020 podcast, Canada's #1 optometry podcast. I am your host, Dr. Harbier Sayan. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me as always to learn and to grow. Always appreciate all the time that you take out of your busy schedules. I know there's a million things you could be doing. The fact that you've tuned in to listen or watch right now means so much to me. And as always, even though I feel so grateful for that, I always still have the request. If you get some value out of this, please share it with a friend, a colleague, a family member, whoever. Put it on Instagram or LinkedIn, or send them a text message. Whatever you could do to help this podcast continue to grow and reach more of our friends and colleagues, so we can help them benefit from these conversations. And today's guest is Mr. Matt Rosner from the NeuroVisual Medicine Institute. We're going to talk a little bit about binocular vision, which is not my strong suit by any means, but Matt's going to break it down for us in ways that are really going to simplify this and help us bring these into our practices, bring this kind of specialty into our practices. So Matt is the Director of Growth at NVMI. He works with practices globally to leverage binocular vision as a source of growth for their businesses. He has a background in hospitality consulting, which, as he said, this always somehow works its way into a conversation, and I imagine it still will, because so much of what we do is like service and hospitality. It really is. So, and I imagine that's going to be involved in when we're trying to implement a specialty and speak to our patients about it. So thanks so much, Matt, for joining me. I appreciate that, and I'm looking forward to this conversation, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me here. I'm excited.
Awesome, dude. So, Matt, tell us a little bit about yourself, and tell us about NVMI, NeuroVisual Medicine Institute. What is it?
Yeah, so NVMI is an organization that was founded about 10 years ago, and it's a family organization founded by two doctors who happen to both be my folks. And before I tell you where we came from, I'll tell you a little bit about what it is. So NeuroVisual Medicine is a new clinical system that's designed to treat neurological and vestibular symptoms using microprism. It's also a business platform designed to enable practices to create a profit center around functional and binocular vision from the front office to the back office. And we know, and you've got some specialties in your practice, it takes a village to start a specialty and do it well and keep it going as a source of growth. And that's something we're really focused on, and the problem space that we're solving in. But where we started is about 25 years ago. And I'll keep it short because there's a long version and a short version. My mom, who's an optometrist, I was on a double date with my dad, who's an emergency physician, and my uncle, who's an ear, nose, and throat doctor. And they were all double dating before anyone was married, and people were still in residency. And my uncle, who was on track to be an ENT, was holding up a loose prism in the back seat of the car. And my mom asked, "What do you got there? What's going on?" And he told her, I have some eye strain. And the chief of ophthalmology at my program said, maybe it'll help, do some exercises. Huh. So he's doing it, and she asked, well, is it working? And he said, not really. And, right out of college, ICO in the 80s, she said, you know what, let's give it a shot. Let's bring you in for an eye exam. Let's see what I can find. And so she brought him in, and she did all the testing and found that he had a subtle phoria. It was about a 0.7 diopter vertical. And so, and this was, in the booming moments of vision therapy in the 80s and 90s. And so she got her Brock string out and started, going and doing some exercises. And within a minute or two, my uncle stops her and he says, Debbie, it's taking too long. Whatever you have to do, get me better faster. And so, right, she's just open to trying things. And so she goes to her Prism box and she gets out some loose prisms and starts working with them. And the only problem was her Prism box didn't have fractional units. It was 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 14 or 16. But his phoria was subdiopter. And so at the moment, she couldn't actually help him. So she needed to go to her local lab and ask sort of an unconventional request, can you make me 38 millimeters that are fractional units? And they gave it a shot. They did great. She brought him back in, trial framed him up, and boom. The minute she hit that sweet spot with the microprism, his eye strain went away. Also, his clumsiness went away, and he would run into door jams as he was walking through them. He didn't have a great sense of space. But once he had his microprisms, it sort of changed everything. And so a couple of years later, he gives her a call, and now he's doing private practice, seeing dizzy patients as an ENT. And he says, Debbie, this is going to be sort of an uncommon request, but I want to start sending you my dizzy patients. And she's thinking, I'm an optometrist. Dizzy's not something we usually take care of. What do you have in mind? And he says, well, ever since you fixed me, I've started seeing these patients and for dizziness, and I'm finding that there's two categories. There's one category that resolves with the proper treatment in my clinic. And there's this other category that doesn't, and they're still dizzy after I do all the things I'm doing. And they also have threads of my story and their story. So I'm thinking, this can't be a coincidence. We got to try it. And so she says, okay, let's do it. And so he refers these two women. They happen to be sisters in their mid 40s. And they are, for all intents and purposes, somewhat disabled. They're not able to live a normal life. One sister is unsteady with her gait, and she uses a cane to get around. And the other sister is always nauseous. She's got cyclical nausea and never know when it's going to strike. And so she brings these two patients in, and she's hoping it all works out, but she's not really sure because she's only done it once before intentionally. And within a couple of hours, she's got the trial frames on both sisters, and they're feeling like radically different people. The one sister with the cane is walking confidently down the hallway wearing her trial frame without the cane, and the other is sort of sitting in the waiting room feeling normal for the first time in 10 plus years. So long story short, she calls him back and she says, okay, you're on to something. This was a perfect referral. What's next? And he says, Debbie, I have hundreds of patients I need to start sending you if this is the case. And that was the beginning of their work together. And they've now co-managed hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of patients together. And it really began to grow. And, early on, microprism or Prism in general was seen from some communities as, Prism is poison or Prism's a crutch. And from others, maybe the ophthalmology community, anything below a certain diopter, and it wasn't even worth taking care of because the body will accommodate. It's not worth it. You're wasting your time. But there was this cohort of patients that kept coming in with these sort of unexplainable or at least untreatable symptoms, and they were working. It was working with the microprism. And so they started doing peer-reviewed research and developing a foundational layer of proof and credibility that we're not just some charlatans. We actually are doing this in a data-based and methodical way. And so, one thing led to another, and they built an institute. And there was a moment in time where patients were getting on Greyhound buses and driving for 2 days from Texas to Michigan for care. And that was a turning point where they said, we really need to figure out a way to democratize this care. We need to be able to train other doctors so that every patient in every region has access to this. And that's when they founded the Institute. And we had 2 clinicians come in 2013. They're our first brave souls to take the training and really take the plunge with us. And now we've passed the 50 clinic mark. And I'm really excited. We actually have our first clinician entering into Canada with NeuroVisual Medicine later this spring. So it's been quite a journey.
That's amazing. That is a really great story. The origins are always kind of interesting. I like to learn the origins of a lot of companies and things like that. So that's kind of cool how it comes together. And the funny thing is, so many times it is sort of this accidental kind of moment. If they didn't happen to be in the car at that moment and he didn't happen to hold up the Prism like that, that might not have all come to fruition. So it's kind of cool how that all comes together. So let's talk a bit about microprism. I think you kind of defined it a bit in there, as this kind of sub-diopter amount. But is there a more technical definition for what microprism is for those of us who may not be super familiar with it?
Yeah, it's not a perfect term, but for us, it means that we're prescribing in quarter diopter increments.
Okay.
And one of the things that has been really important to make this clinical work so systematized is to make sure that whatever the patient's trialing, you can actually get from the lab. And so one of the things that's been really important is to ensure that we're actually going way above ANSI standards. So it's quarter diopter units in eighth diopter precision. So plus or minus eighth diopter to make sure that we're as close as possible on that prescription.
Oh, okay. Got it. And so in this, like, how has, was it whoever, it was your mom or whoever along the process, kind of figured out why does microprism work? Do we understand this? Why do we need microprism? I think I've heard this concept of like Prism is a bit of a crutch, but could be. But I've also then now made friends and colleagues who use Prism quite a lot in their practices, well beyond my kind of understanding of it. But why do we need microprism in our practice to help our patients?
Yeah. So before we talk about microprism, let's just talk about prism.
Okay.
So most clinicians in the U.S. and Canada, when they see a patient who comes in saying they see two of something, they have diplopia or double vision, that's usually the sign that they need to break out the Prism kit.
Yeah. Right.
It's an obvious one. The patient knows it's an issue. They know it's their eyes, and they can verbally explain exactly what's going on. That only accounts for about a third of the patients that we treat. So there's about 60% of patients that aren't seeing double. They're still symptomatic, and they're not really sure where it's coming from. So I guess I'm not the OD, but I pretend on TV. And so the way that I would explain Prism to those who are not really familiar or comfortable with it and microprism is that all we're doing is identifying how much misalignment exists both horizontally and vertically between the two eyes, and using Prism to change where the image hits on the back of the eye, so that the brain is no longer processing, let's say, two slightly separate images, but we've now merged those images, and the brain has to do less processing work to achieve that image singularity.
Got it. And what's the kind of the age group of patients that can benefit from this? Are we talking potentially kids benefit from this, or is it mainly just adults?
Yeah, so we'll call her Dr. Debbie. It's easier than my mom.
Yeah, that's a better way of
So
going.
one of the things Dr. Debbie says is, and she's got a lot of great nuggets and quotes. One of them is, we treat patients from age 2 to 92. The thing is, it looks different for different age ranges. So for kids, we might say that they're car sick. For adults, we might say they're motion sick, or they just don't like going on carnival rides.
Right.
And so for each category of patients, we're looking at, so for those younger kids, those are kids that are struggling in school. They have a hard time reading the board in the classroom. They are struggling with reading and reading comprehension. Oftentimes they can be put into a sort of a support track, a reading support track. And, for differential diagnoses, a lot of them have been diagnosed or at least thought of as having ADD, ADHD, sometimes dyslexia. And I know LD, learning disability, has become more visible in the last 5 years. A lot of patients are diagnosed or at least assigned with that label. For our older patients, though, we're looking at people who have fatigue after a long day on the screen, and also people who are feeling dizzy or off balance. And this can happen either from birth, and they have this, a physically facial eye misalignment that's causing it, or it can be caused by a traumatic brain injury or an acquired brain injury, like a concussion or a slip and fall. And then the last category of patients are our elderly patients. And the two main things that we find for patients, usually 65 and older, are one, they're at risk of falling. They're not very balanced or steady on their feet. A lot of times the impact of microprism can be huge for them. And the other are those that get, let's say, a cataract surgery, and they now have unexplainable symptoms or diplopia. And those are perfect candidates for this.
Very common. Yeah. So that last one, definitely something that, relates, or I could relate to, is like so many patients after cataract surgery are like, how come I kind of see double all the time, or like it doesn't line up, and I've never had this issue before, and they're upset with the cataract surgeon. But it's just, unfortunately, that there is, for whatever reason, maybe you can explain, but sometimes these little misalignments are uncovered when the surgery is done. And there's quite a few patients who have that. One thing I wanted to ask you was, are we talking both vertical and horizontal prism here? And can you do both at the same time?
Yes. Yeah. And just to like tack back on the cataract surgery
Hmm.
example, our theory, our understanding is that because they had an eye that wasn't giving them a clear image, they were able to sort of decompensate,
Right.
and they weren't leveraging that eye or that image as intently or at all. And the minute that they now have clarity on both images, the misalignment is very clear. And
Hmm.
so yeah, and we find that, when patients get their chief complaint treated completely or almost completely, the second most frustrating complaint becomes the one that's
Now that's the chief.
crucial, that they weren't really complaining about before, but now
Yeah.
is imperative to fix.
Well, that actually makes me feel better, because what you the reasoning that you just gave me about, like, their vision was not that clear, so they were able to kind of function or decompensate, like you said. That's actually one of the in my mind, the logical reason that I give to patients, like, well, you just weren't seeing very clearly. You didn't notice that you had this little discrepancy. And once you start seeing clear, kind of like also a lot of patients notice floaters after surgery. Some of that's because of just the shaking that happens during the surgery and whatnot. But otherwise, other times it's because now all of a sudden there's so much light entering the eye, they start to notice these little discrepancies in their vision. So that was, thankfully, I'm glad that you said that, because it helps confirm the answer that I've been giving to my patients.
And the best part is they don't need another surgery. Right? Like they don't
Yeah.
need, they don't, and they also don't need to suffer with diplopia. I mean, the microprism is such a quick and easy fix, and they're usually pretty stunned that that's all it was. There's a
Mm.
concern. The more birthdays you celebrate, the more concerned you get about health scares,
Sure.
and this is one of those things we can just say, nope, we can fix this, and this is non-invasive, and it's easy to do.
Yeah. So
So with
going back to
vertical and
vertical and
horizontal,
horizontal. Yeah.
yeah, so we can do both simultaneously, and a lot of patients have both. And one of the things that I found in meeting and talking with hundreds of optometrists is horizontal, not so scary.
Yeah.
Vertical, a little more scary.
Sure.
And the reason is, if you get horizontal prism or microprism wrong, you just cause a little eye strain, little headache. When you get vertical prism wrong, you make them sick, and you can make them dizzy or have vertigo. And so a lot of practitioners, feel much more comfortable on the horizontal plane with prism and don't really do much in the way of vertical prism. But in the work that we do a lot of horizontal and vertical together. But it completely depends on the patient's eye posture and what misalignment they're
Mm.
measuring.
Hmm. Yeah. Just speaking with, again, some experts in the space, who know a lot more than I do, but they kind of say sometimes we only, we don't really think about vertical and the microprism and the vertical and how powerful that can be. And I've spoken to a couple who say, yeah, I gave a half base up or down, or whatever it was, a amount that they gave in both eyes or one eye, and it was a profound change. Again, I think you're right. I would agree. I'm probably in that category of, like, horizontal, I don't mind messing around a little bit. Vertical, I'm kind of like, I think I'll just refer you out for this one. So I would agree with that. So, all right, we kind of defined what microprism is, and you guys have your standards of a quarter diopter plus or minus an eighth. Did I get that right? An eighth?
Quarter diopter increments, but an eighth precision,
Right.
so
Plus or
tolerance
minus
plus
an
or
eighth.
minus.
Got it. Um, we see that there are patients who can benefit from it, not just because they have double vision, but they have strain, they have these other sort of more subtle symptoms. Now, the next question kind of comes to, well, in my phoropter, it's only, the lines are single diopter, but I guess if I go in between, I could probably guess kind of where the half diopter is. How do we measure a quarter diopter?
Yeah, so quarter diopter we measure. It's part of a sort of a three-part process that we do. And over the last 25 years, we've developed and refined a clinical protocol to identify and enable that prescription at a quarter diopter. So the first thing we do in an exam is we'll call it the measurement phase, or the data collection phase, where we're doing about 17 different tests in the lane. Some are standard, right? So cross cylinder, vertical vergence near and far, and others are less mainstream, like a gait analysis or a posture analysis or a
Mm-hmm.
sway test to figure out how much of these symptoms are truly visual and how much are maybe coming from the inner ear or other parts of the body, other systems. Um, and so first, we're just collecting all that data. The step that we do next is we analyze it. We figure out, okay, where are these symptoms coming from? What's going on? And how should we begin prescribing? And really where the quarter diopters get into play is once we start trial framing. So we now know generally what direction the prism needs to go in, how severe the misalignment is. But until we get into the trial frame, that's really where the rubber meets the road.
Mm.
And patients build that RX, that prism prescription collaboratively with us, right? So, in an average lane, we're saying what's clear, 1 or 2. With these patients, it's what feels better, 1 or 2. And they are a participant in that. And our goal, and the data helps us show that on average, we're able to get patients 50% symptom relief in that first exam with that trial framing and microprism.
Gotcha. So why don't we dig a bit more into that? Like, what does that look like when we're trying to implement um, something like this into primary care? What type of um, what am I thinking about here? Wow, what type of instruments and lenses and like what are when somebody does set this up and comes to NVMI, what do they have in their office now? What kinds of kit do you provide? So I imagine there's lots of little lenses, the trial frame, and so on. Is that what it looks like?
Yeah. There's a whole kit of equipment that we've developed to basically replicate and enable any clinician to replicate the results we're able to achieve at our headquarters clinic in Michigan, where the institute's based. But I think before that, if I want to just, we talked about measurement, analysis, and prescription. There's one thing that happens that I didn't talk about, which is
Mm,
screening.
I
How do
got
we
you.
know if these
Right,
patients are good candidates?
right.
So the way that we do it is we've developed a symptom questionnaire called the BVDQ, stands for Binocular Vision Dysfunction Questionnaire. And we've been talking about microprism, but we really haven't talked much about BVD, or this umbrella term of binocular vision dysfunctions.
Right.
And so, well, let's talk about BVD for 1 minute, and then we'll talk about how we screen for it. So
Sure.
the symptoms that we were talking about with those pediatric patients, the middle-aged patients, and the elderly patients is a pretty big list of various symptoms that live under the BVD umbrella. There's the obvious ones. We've got the reading challenges, we've got diplopia, we've got eye strain and light sensitivity. But there's a whole host of novel symptoms that we've now connected to subtle phorias and misalignments, like feeling dizzy, feeling nauseous, car sickness, ADHD or ADD type symptoms,
Mhm.
dyslexia, chronic neck pain. And that one we can explain by patients having a head tilt to compensate for their vertical misalignment.
I
And
see.
once we correct the prism, their posture straightens.
Huh.
So there's this entire layer of symptoms that patients don't know to go to optometrists for, because if I have a headache, I'm going to the neurologist, or if I have,
Right.
dizziness, I'm going to the ENT. And so what we do is, over the last 2 decades, we built this questionnaire and got it scientifically validated to tell us, based on all the symptoms, both frequency and severity, do you possibly have BVD? Are you possibly struggling with a misalignment that could be treated easily with microprism? And so patients take this questionnaire, takes about 3 to 4 minutes to complete. It's got 25 questions on the front, 10 on the back, and it's easy to score. And when patients score above 15 on the BVDQ, it tells us that they need that care and that they're
Mm.
symptomatic enough to warrant a neurovisual evaluation. And in an average practice, and we're talking about how to implement this in a primary care practice, we're looking at about 1 in 5 patients
Mm.
that will score above that symptomatic threshold
Oh, wow.
and warrant a neurovisual assessment. And so that's one of the ways that we help practices sort of get the gears moving and get their first, couple of wins and get their momentum, is by helping them internally refer patients with a really strong data set from the BVDQ to say, yes, you need this help. We likely can help you. Let's get in and figure out how we can really make the difference.
I appreciate you doing that, because I'm mentioning the screening, because for me, having gone into a couple of different sort of specialty areas in optometry, I should know by now that that's always like the first step. How do you have to figure out who are the patients who are going to actually need this treatment? So dry eye is the perfect analogy in this case. Years ago when I started getting into dry eye, I was kind of like, well, who are the dry eye patients? Well, they don't often walk in and say, hey guys, I'm here for dry eye. They just walk in, they have complaints of different things, and you need to kind of weed them out from the others, and the screening questions are the best way to do that. So in dry eye there's a screener. In other specialty areas, there's always screening questions, for various things. So it makes sense that there would be for this, of course, and that way you can start to filter out those people who are candidates for this treatment, after it's implemented in the practice. So that's really good. And then I guess from there, let's say they've done the screening test, they would go, they come into my office just for a routine eye exam, let's say.
Yeah.
Give them the screening questionnaire. They score 18, and we're like, well, you clearly are suffering from a lot of these symptoms. We can help you. They would go through their normal routine eye exam, and then they would come back separately for the NVMI stuff. Is that correct?
Yeah, you got it. And so through that, routine eye exam, you as a doc get to ask them questions like, hey, how does this motion sickness impact you? One of the things we'll hear is that people get dizzy while driving, or anxious on the highway, or anxious in big spaces or in crowds. I was on a demo call for a totally different product the other day, and out of nowhere, the person on the other end of the call, the Zoom call, said, wait a minute, is this BVD, like the TikTok thing where, I said, yeah, what symptoms? I said, let me flip this. I'm going
Are
to
you
go
guys on TikTok, Matt?
demo.
Is that what it is?
I said, but let me ask you, like, how do you have these symptoms? And she said, yeah, I always get sort of anxious in big crowds or in shopping malls. I get a little dizzy. And so it really is everywhere.
Yeah.
And people don't know that the dots are connected until they take that BVDQ. And a lot of times patients will say, how did you know? Like, I've never seen all these questions in one list.
Mm-hmm.
And I had no idea they were all connected, but this makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. And TikTok is like the source for all medical information these days, right? So get out there. People are learning from TikTok. We need to be on TikTok to teach them. We need to be the ones teaching them. Okay.
Yes.
So that's amazing. All right. So tell me a bit about, like, because I know there's going to be, and because I'm wondering this, I know there's going to be other colleagues out there wondering, okay, what's the process? Like, how long does it take for me to get set up? Like, who comes in, who does the training, like all of that kind of stuff? Can you share a little bit of that information? We don't need to go too in depth, because of course, ultimately, if somebody's really interested, I want them to come to you and learn about that. But give us a high level of what that would entail.
Yeah. So I want to make sure I answer your previous question was, what does treatment actually look like?
Right.
So treatment takes,
I don't even remember what questions I'm asking you.
This is good. So treatment takes, for the average patient, about 6 to 8 weeks.
Okay.
And there are 2 neurovisual exams for the average patient, and that's really all they need. Of course, there are 5-ish% of more complex patients that don't fit the mold, but on average, we'll take patients in, we'll do an initial neurovisual evaluation. We're doing those tests, that analysis, and that initial prescription, and then they start wearing that new prismatic prescription. And for patients that have never worn Prism before, it can be sort of a weird experience if you don't know what to expect. And there's a shift that happens in the visual system and the physical, there's relaxation that happens, because a lot of these patients are doing their best, whether consciously or subconsciously, to avoid double vision. So the head tilt is a perfect example. People don't usually know they have a head tilt, but the minute they straighten up, they sort of get uncomfortable visually with it, as if they're trying to just self-correct it. And so, what we find is, once they start wearing that initial prescription, we call it progressive relaxation, which really means that it's going to shift, it's going to change, and your need for an adjustment is almost inevitable. Because what we're doing in that initial exam is we're addressing their tightened visual system. It's on high alert, fight or flight. But once we give them that initial prescription, and oftentimes there's tints and various filters we leverage as well, everything starts to relax. And you'll see it. Patients say, what did you do? I feel more relaxed. I'm less anxious, and my neck feels
like under a spell or
taller. Yeah. And so that doesn't stop at the end of the exam. It keeps going.
I
But
see.
the issue is, once you relax to a certain degree, we need to treat a different visual system. And your eyes are going to be in a different posture with that
Mm,
less tension. Your extraocular muscles might be more relaxed, and the pressure on the actual eyeball might be different. So all these factors come into play. And what we found is, if we can bring them back in about 4 to 6 weeks after their initial exam, we're able to re-prescribe, we remeasure their system, and we find that patients on average can need both a shift in refraction as well as a shift in
mm,
prism.
I see.
But once they're in that more relaxed state and we're able to prescribe that sort of final everyday prescription, for most patients, it gets them 80% symptom relief, and we'll see them back in a year. And that's where their sort of treatment stabilizes with us.
Got it.
So from an
So that,
implementation
if you
standpoint,
could, if you
oh yeah,
could estimate for me, Matt, how much time would you say chair time in minutes or hours are we looking as average as you can give me, right? The average person they've done the questionnaire, they've what have scored over 15. Um, how much extra chair time in addition to the routine comprehensive eye exam are we thinking that this person would need?
yeah. So the average sort of neurovisual patient course of care will occupy about 130 minutes of
Okay,
clinical time
just over two
in
hours,
total. Yeah.
including the routine eye exam. Is that what we're talking, or this outside of the
No,
routine? Outside.
outside of the routine
Got it.
exam.
Yeah. So that's fair. I mean, you would expect this is going to take time. It's not an easy in and out process, but I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind, right? So if somebody's implementing this into their practice, you're going to need the space in the sense of, like, I don't know how much physical, you can tell me how much physical space, square footage you'd need, but you'd also need just a chair where you would do this while perhaps routine eye exams are happening in the other room, right? You have to kind of keep that in mind. Or if this is taking up your chair time for routine eye exams, then you have to start looking at revenue there and how much sense does it make to be doing this instead of a routine eye exam. In my mind, I'm seeing these things happening concurrently, right? So if I'm doing the NVMI stuff, I would probably have an associate still seeing patients in the other room just so I can make sure that the office is still running. I don't know if you have thoughts on that, but the other part of that question was, like, square footage wise, do we need a whole bunch more room? Do we need a normal exam lane? What do we need?
Yeah. So in terms of how to implement this, the first clinic that did this in 2013, their intent was to cold start a neurovisual clinic.
Hmm.
That's it.
Oh, wow.
And so we thought, okay, amazing. Everyone wants to cold start neurovisual clinics. It wasn't the case. It turned out that, she was amazing, but also an outlier, an early outlier. And we have a
Hmm.
couple of clinics that are pivoting towards doing only neurovisual medicine as full time. But what we found is most practices like doing this a day a week or two
Mm,
days a week. And they like their sclerals, they enjoy their myopia management, and they do neurovisual for a half day, 1 day, or 2 days a week.
gotcha.
And so based on that, what we know to be true is, if you're seeing primary care patients, it's inevitable you'll be able to cross refer into your specialty. And
Mm,
so there's sort of a neat correlation to how that works, and how you can pull those screened patients for BVD in for further evaluation. But the revenue here is great, and it rivals revenues for myopia management in terms of revenue per OD hour. Dry eye, same thing, and it's, while the revenue and profitability, it rivals those and is right on par. What's interesting is the patient psychology.
mhm,
So when you're working with various treatments, there's different levels of pain that patients are experiencing. Sometimes we just want to get patients in for an aesthetic treatment. The pain is relatively low. Desire
mm,
can be medium to high, but they really have to want it from an internal desire standpoint. But for a lot of these neurovisual patients, the psychology is, and we did a study in 2014 to figure out where these patients are coming from and what's their experience before they hit our door. And it turns out that the average neurovisual patient spends about 3 to 5 years looking for help,
wow.
bouncing from doctor to doctor, right? They
Okay.
went to all the obvious. They went to the ENT, they went to the neurologist,
Yeah, yeah.
PTs or OTs. They got all the scans, but they're still symptomatic and still looking for help. And so when you get that patient that comes into your door, it's a completely different psychology, and they're a little bit, I guess, desperate might be the right. They're searching. And
Mhm.
so it's unlike some of our other specialties, which maybe we identify in the chair and say, hey, you might need this. Think about it. Here's some information. With these patients, the minute you mention it, they say, wait, you can help with my dizziness?
Right.
And so it's a different sort of sale or psychological process to get them in and get them care.
Yeah,
Um,
that's fair. Yeah, they've been suffering for a long time, so they're gonna be more driven or motivated to, look for the options that might help treat their conditions. Um, so which we talked about bringing this into a primary care practice. One of the questions actually I think, I wanted to clarify was, what's the process of bringing it in? Like, so training for the doctor and the staff, what does that kinda look like?
yeah. So doing a specialty right, we need everybody on board. And we know that one or two dissenting staff members can mean the death of a specialty, uh, or at least a really slow start to a new
Yeah.
specialty. And so being an office of 35 staff with 5 full-time clinicians seeing neurovisual patients in Michigan, our headquarter clinic, this is all we do. And so that's where we headquarters our training out of as well.
I see.
And so we focus on sort of 2 tracks. One is the operational side, and one's the clinical side. And so the clinical side is about 8 weeks of pre-training studying. We've got a neurovisual manual, a full sort of
Mm,
textbook of all of the pathophysiology, the
wow.
research, as well as the practical step-by-step protocols that we use and train and leverage across the globe. And then their capstone, sort of the height of their training, is an in-person 5-day hands-on masterclass
Okay.
with Dr. Debbie and our clinical team in Michigan, where by the middle of that training week, they're actually seeing our new patients that we scheduled for their
Oh,
training,
cool.
supervised by one of our neurovisual optometrists. They're next to them the entire day.
That's
And
great.
so from a, will it work standpoint, will I learn this? Am I going to succeed in this? We are set on making sure you don't fail. And so the last part of clinical training is we create a clinical coaching program that extends 6 months after the initial training,
Okay.
where we look at their cases on a biweekly basis, and do sort of mini grand rounds with them and assist them in helping fine-tune their techniques and make sure that they feel comfortable and they feel like they've got their flow, and guiding them when the results weren't expected or need tweaking. And so
Mhm,
that's how
mhm.
we get the clinician up to speed and confident with this work. And then for the staff, in that same 8 weeks of pre-training, we're doing training with the staff as well. So this is a different patient demographic than most clinics are used to. So the questions that the front desk staff or your scheduling staff are going to get are also totally different.
Right.
And we've built resources and trainings and live trainings with our team on how to answer those questions and how to have that conversation and how to analyze the BVEQ, which is an important thing that we actually rely on the staff to do rather than the clinician, to make that
Right.
an efficiency within the practice. And also how to set up billing, right? If you're in the US and billing medical insurance, how to make sure you're getting paid for this via medical. And so there's all these little nuances and operational pieces to make sure that clinics are not only successful with this in the exam lane, but also, in the P&L as well.
Yeah, that's something that a lot of people are gonna wanna know is how they're going to be successful in the P&L as well. Uh, but it's good to hear that there's such intensive training, because I feel like that when you're trying to do something like this, especially coming from, again, my perspective where I have very little background in this, I would want to feel really confident. And the fact that you get hands-on training with actual patients is, I think, is invaluable as well. And then of course the coaching after the fact, because a lot of times you feel like you know something, and then when you actually get into practicing and seeing patients, you're like, wait a minute, I didn't learn about this specific scenario, or I don't remember like what to do in this specific scenario if this like little one thing goes wrong. So having the coaching after the fact is really key. So from what you've seen, Matt, in the clinics that you've onboarded to this point, are there practices or doctors that are better suited for this, or who is the right clinician and what is the right type of clinic for NVMI?
Yeah, it's a great question, and we keep refining, who we find to be the best fit. But at the core of all of this, we found that the doctors who are heart-centered, and not saying that not all doctors are heart-centered, but some, their heart is more forward,
Sure.
are, a high level of EQ is really important for this work. But from a sort of demographic standpoint, there's 4 or 5 things that we found clinicians to really gravitate to this because of. And one of the ones that comes to mind is clinicians who are aware of these symptoms, but and they're trying some things, but they're not satisfied with the results they're getting. That I would say is one of the biggest motivators. Another one is, when clinicians are sort of going down the vision plan route, and they're seeing, they've developed a high volume model, sort of accidentally, maybe not on purpose, but it just that's how the economics worked, and they just sort of went down that route, and they're getting tired, and they don't know if they can do 20 or 30 patients a day as they age into their 50s or their 60s. And so this is one of those specialties that, we didn't talk about how many patients you see a day, but if you do the math, you can see between 7 and 8 neurovisual patients a day while making the same revenue you would from having an entire day of primary care. And so for clinicians that are looking to sort of get that breather and sort of pivot their career towards something that maybe is a little slower pace without slowing the revenue, a little more joy and this patient connection, that's perfect for them. And I think the last one is clinicians that want something more out of their career, right? The spinning and grinning, or just doing basic refractions or primary care doesn't really like keep them in the game. It's maybe not what they intended or they thought their career would look like. They wanted to do something more medical or add specialties to sort of spice up the clinical day-to-day, and this can be an amazing fit for them. And the last thing we found that's been really sort of surprising to us, but I guess not so surprising now that we've done it enough, is multi-doc clinics who, they have young associates that are in the midst of building their books, but they haven't yet built a healthy, complete patient, book or patient schedule yet, and they've got holes and they're not booked out very far. When you have a couple of other doctors seeing a couple hundred patients a week in total, that volume can generate a really healthy referral base for an associate that's doing neurovisual medicine. So it's one way to sort of catapult a slow or underperforming associate to a much higher level revenue-wise and volume-wise, because you now have something additional to offer.
Yeah, I love that. That's actually, first of all, spinning and grinning. First time I've heard that. I like that phrase. I'm going to take that. I'm going to borrow that if you don't mind. The second thing, I think that's such a great point, Matt. I talked to younger ODs. In fact, last night I did an event where I was speaking to about 20 odd young ODs about like ways that I think that they could maybe elevate their career and get the most out of their practice. And that was one of the things, is like specializing in some way can be super beneficial. One, from like just having a fulfilling career, two, maybe new ways to generate revenue for yourself. But three, like to become more valuable, if you're working as an associate, to become more valuable in the eyes of the owner. This young OD is more valuable to me because they are I can send them these patients that I want. We can keep them within our clinic, right? The BV patients or the dry eye patients or the whatever patients, we can keep them within our clinic, offer the specialty, the revenue still coming to the clinic, right? It's win-win for everybody. So I think that's cool that you guys have caught that. It makes a lot of sense. And I would encourage any younger ODs listening to this, if you're into BV and you're looking for a way to maybe implement BV into a practice, this might be your way in, and also a way for you to generate more revenue while you're building up your patient base. So that's a great point.
Yeah, one thing I just throw in there, and what we thought when we started, we thought that practices and clinicians that do binocular vision already, that do vision therapy or that already prescribe Prism, they would be the ideal fit for neurovisual medicine.
Right. Right.
But it turns out, and not passing judgment, just looking at the data, the majority of the clinicians who pursue neurovisual medicine didn't actually like binocular vision in school.
Yeah. I know
They were,
somebody who fits that mold.
yeah. So, talk to us. I'm curious. You've pursued specialties, right? You've got a number of specialty services that you personally offer and specialize in. What about BV throughout your journey didn't feel like it was the right direction?
I like this that you're flipping the script here and asking me the questions, Matt. This is good. Um, Honestly, to me, in school, it just always felt too complex. Like felt too. Oh man, it's hard to put into words. Like it didn't feel tangible enough, or like some of the dots were not connecting for me. Maybe it was the way that it was taught was too perceptual versus like being more practical. But I have friends who went into it and absolutely love it. So maybe it was just not. Maybe it just doesn't resonate with me at the time. And now, when I'm in practice, I just don't see. I feel like it's way too much training that would be needed for me to become not like an expert, but even somebody who is capable and competent in the world of BV. So I'll throw in a little bit of Prism here and there, sure, during the routine eye exam, but anything beyond like a little bit of horizontal Prism that, if that doesn't resolve the symptoms, just like we talked about earlier, that person's going over to a friend of mine who's going to help take care of them. So I think that's what it is. Like something like dry eye, I was able to sort of like just tiptoe into, take little steps into dry eye. I would, start selling dry eye products in the office. Then I might buy a not super expensive, but easy to implement piece of equipment and kind of went into it. And same goes with myopia management. We started with, using atropine eye drops. Then we were able to sell the MyoSmart glasses and the contact. We were able to kind of step into it without me having to go and do a ton of training to become an expert in it. I was able to just practically become an expert. But I don't feel like BV is that easy to get into. So that's where that would be my hesitation, or has been over the years.
Yeah, and it's we hear that a lot, and I think that when clinicians have tried it, or they, the critique we get a lot from clinicians who are curious, but it never resonated in school, was that it wasn't practical. There wasn't a step-by-step approach that I could take to help this patient. There was the doc that I talked to, and she said, I can look in the back of a slit lamp in the back of the eye, and I can identify a disease,
Yes.
I can treat it. It's easy.
Yep.
Binocular vision, it didn't feel that way when I
Yeah.
was learning it. And so that's really one of the key, although we had this meandering path of discovery and refinement, that's one of the key problems that we wanted to solve for ODs is how can we make BV or functional vision approachable? How can we make it step by step so that that you're not missing something? And I think that's usually the challenge is either sometimes it works or sometimes it doesn't. And I do a little bit here when it's diplopia, but otherwise I don't really look too deeply into it. And to give them, and so what we've built really is a roadmap. It's a playbook that you can take and just know that you're going to be successful because 50,000 patients have been through this protocol, and 50 other clinics at this moment in time have onboarded this same exact clinical protocol with the same exact business model, and are prioritizing this over their primary care or other specialties that weren't giving them either as much traction or as much joy. So there still might be hope.
Yeah. I think, well, no, this is kind of what would be needed, I think, to get more people into BV is a step-by-step, even though, of course, there is still, like we talked about, pretty intensive training that's involved and needed, but still simplifying it to a point where it feels tangible and practical and not super, and again, I'm not taking shots at anybody. I have colleagues that I look up to, and I'm just amazed by what they do in the BV world, but they've been kind of entrenched in it for years, or they've been interested in it since school. Now, for me, 14 years into practice, it's kind of like, can you teach an old dog new tricks here, right? So you're going to simplify it a lot, so this old dog can actually bring it into the practice. So this is something that feels like maybe there's a path, maybe there's a chance Harbir can get into BV here, at least into the world of micro Prism, right? So
Yeah.
definitely, I appreciate you guys are doing that.
And if one thing that we talked about before jumping on the podcast was, we didn't just sort of put this out and assume that there was a demand. Our growth actually came from the need for patients traveling from, across state lines or across country.
Right.
And that didn't just happen one time. It happens, on a daily basis. And
Mm.
the information that we put out on the patient side for BVD has been all about giving them that context, giving them that education. When they search headaches plus eye strain plus dizziness, one of our articles pops up, and they're able to take that BVDQ online, and then we get to refer them, or they actually refer themselves directly to one of the clinicians within our network. And so, when there's that demand coming from the internet and from the network, it takes a specialty that you're not sure if it's going to really click or
Yeah.
create that momentum, and we're pushing them to you. So you really
Yeah.
have no way to fail, because we're supporting you on the clinical side, and we're making sure that there's a starting volume of patients to see, both within your clinic and externally. So
Yeah.
we really want every clinician and work hard to make sure every clinician is successful.
That's great. And that's really helpful too, right? Because I've seen in cases where it's like, okay, here's your new piece of equipment, see you later, in whatever specialty area you might be in. But to be able to be there to support in that way, but to actually try to bring traffic into the practice, that's super helpful. I think having the questionnaire, that helps you uncover who in your current practice is a candidate for this. But the fact that NVMI does kind of patient facing, promotional or educational stuff that helps the public become more aware of this and then draws those new people into the practice, I think that's really valuable.
Yeah, and we're on a mission. We've been talking a lot about business, and I love the business aspect, as consulting with practices, but really it started with helping a singular patient, and then
Mm.
all of these complex and diverse patients came out of the woodwork from their clinicians and lots of referrals. So we've just been challenged over the decades to fix this or figure this out,
Mm.
and we know that the demand is huge, and our hunch. Right, we make and drink the Kool-Aid, so take this with a grain of salt. But knowing that 20% of patients are symptomatic for BV symptoms, even if they don't identify it as a BV issue initially, that means that 1 in 5 people, not just patients, but people more broadly, are walking around every day
Mm.
struggling with motion sickness or light sensitivity or chronic neck pain. And so, from a broader view, we always talk about how to differentiate, but also how to expand scope, right? And we talk about, surgical elements that optometrists are now able to do with lasers and such, pharmaceuticals, and scope is expanded that way.
Mm.
But this also, from a sort of a 30,000-foot view, as we bring visibility and education to the patients, as we're doing now, but at a greater scale, this really, sows the seeds for an expanded scope for optometrists, who want to access a larger part of their community and care for a larger part of their community, but just don't have the tools yet.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love that. That's great. I think expanding scope and continually offering better, newer and better excuse me, that sneeze that was supposed to come at the beginning of the podcast finally came. All right. Constantly expanding the scope and offering better services to our patients. That's kind of, that's what's going to help the profession continue to strengthen over the years. So Matt, I want to say a big thank you. I'm going to kind of wrap up here, but before we do, any final words of wisdom, anything like last message that you want to share with everybody who's listening and watching?
Yeah, your scope is not defined by what you can see in the slit lamp, and case history is such a huge part of uncovering what patients are struggling with. So I would say, ask and listen, and we'll make accessible the BVDQ in the show notes. So if anyone's curious and wants to start screening for these symptoms in your clinic, We're there to support you even at this early stage, and would love
Mhm.
to, be in conversation with you. But yeah, there are a lot of patients out there, and they're currently in your exam chair. They just don't know to tell you that they're struggling with those symptoms.
Mhm.
So when we start asking, we start learning all sorts of things, and can open up that window to help those patients.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Definitely, there'll be some links in the show notes to NVMI, to the questionnaire, and other things that can help kind of lead people in the right direction. So make sure you go down there, click on some of those links. Thanks again, Matt. Appreciate this. This was very educational for me, and I'm sure anybody who's listening and watching was taking away some insights as well. I appreciate you taking the time, and we'll I'm sure we'll be touching base at some point down the road as well.
Sounds
So,
good. Thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate the conversation.
yeah, my pleasure, man. Thank you. And thank you to everybody who's listening and watching to the 2020 podcast, Canada's #1 optometry podcast. I'll see you guys in the next episode.